Have you ever had that unsettling feeling, like someone's watching you, even when you're completely alone? Or heard the faint creak of a floorboard in a house that should be empty? These aren't just tricks of the mind. They're the kinds of moments that linger, the kind that follow you well after the night ends. Tonight, we dive into 3 chilling encounters that might just change the way you look at silence and solitude. You won't want to blink, because these stories are designed to keep you on edge. Before we get started, if you love spine-tingling stories like these, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these creepy encounters, or if you've ever had a similar experience yourself. Let's begin, but remember, sometimes the real horrors are the ones that lurk just beyond the edge of your vision. The Silent Pursuer. James pulled his jacket tighter as he stepped outside into the crisp night air. The familiar neon glow of the sandwich shop sign flickered above him, casting a pale, uneven light on the deserted parking lot. The sound of distant traffic hummed faintly in the background, but here, at the edge of the city, the streets were eerily silent. He glanced down at the receipt in his hand. One final delivery for the night, and then he could head home, collapse onto his worn-out couch, and maybe squeeze in a few hours of sleep before his morning classes. Elmwood Street, James muttered under his breath, typing the address into his phone's GPS. The name didn't ring a bell, which wasn't surprising. He'd been delivering sandwiches for nearly a year, and the city still managed to surprise him with hidden neighborhoods and uncharted cul-de-sacs. The location was just 15 minutes away, a straightforward drive, according to the GPS. But as James pulled out of the parking lot and onto the main road, a strange unease settled over him. The further James drove, the quieter the world seemed to become. Streetlights thinned out, leaving long stretches of road illuminated only by his car's headlights. Trees loomed on either side, their skeletal branches reaching into the inky blackness above. When he finally turned onto Elmwood Street, he immediately noticed how pristine everything looked. The houses were large and uniform, with perfectly trimmed lawns and identical mailboxes. But there was something off, something unsettling about the stillness. No lights glowed from inside the homes. No cars were parked in the driveways. It felt less like a neighborhood and more like a lifeless diorama. As James slowed to a stop at a red light, he became aware of a black car idling beside him. Its windows were heavily tinted, offering no glimpse of the driver inside. James glanced over briefly, then looked away, a shiver running down his spine. There was something oppressive about the car's presence, like it was watching him, even though logic told him otherwise. The light turned green. James hesitated for a moment, then pressed the gas pedal. The black car didn't move. It just sat there, unmoving, as he drove away. James arrived at the address, a house near the end of the street. Like the others, it was pristine but dark, its windows reflecting only the dim glow of his car's headlights. He parked at the curb, grabbed the delivery bag, and walked up the stone pathway to the front door. The silence was deafening. Even the usual night sounds, crickets, distant barking, the rustle of leaves were absent. James knocked twice and waited, the sound echoing in the still air. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. The door creaked open, the motion slow and deliberate, as if inviting him inside. "Hello," James called out, peering into the darkness. He could just make out the outlines of furniture, covered in white sheets, like the house had been abandoned mid-move. Dust motes floated lazily in the beam of light from his phone. "Anyone here? Your order's at the door." Still no response. James placed the bag on the doorstep and turned back toward his car. That's when he noticed it. The black car, parked a few houses down. It hadn't been there when he arrived. James froze. His pulse quickened as he stared at the vehicle. Its headlights were off, but he could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching him. Swallowing hard, he quickened his pace, fumbling with his keys as he reached his car. Sliding into the driver's seat, he locked the doors and started the engine. He glanced in the rearview mirror, and his blood ran cold. There was movement in the back seat. James didn't wait to confirm what he saw. He flung the door open and bolted back toward the house. His mind raced as he stumbled onto the porch, glancing back just in time to see a figure emerge from his car. A tall man in black clothing, his face obscured by a hood. The man didn't run after him. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, as if sizing James up. "Who the hell are you?" James shouted, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Then, without warning, he turned and sprinted into the shadows, disappearing between the houses. James's breathing was ragged as he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. His hands shook as he tried to explain what had happened, but his words came out jumbled and frantic. When the police arrived, they searched the area thoroughly but found no trace of the man. The black car was gone, leaving no evidence of its presence. One of the officers, a grizzled veteran with a skeptical expression, shook his head as he examined the house. "This place has been empty for months," he said. "These are all new builds. Nobody's moved in yet." James stared at him, his mind reeling. If the house was empty, then who had placed the order? And more importantly, who had been waiting for him? James couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man in black, standing in the shadows, his faceless gaze boring into him. The house, the black car, the reflection in his back seat. It all played on a loop in his mind. Who had ordered the food? Why had the door opened on its own? And who was that man? His phone buzzed on the nightstand, jolting him upright. It was a text from an unknown number. "Did you get home safely?" James stared at the message, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't recognize the number, but the words sent a chill down his spine. His fingers hovered over the screen. Finally, he typed back, "Who is this?" The response came almost instantly. "Just making sure you're okay, James." The air left his lungs. Whoever this was knew his name. The next day, James couldn't shake the paranoia that followed him like a shadow. At school, he found himself glancing over his shoulder. His senses heightened to every sound, every movement. By the time his shift at the sandwich shop started, he was already exhausted. The hum of the kitchen, the chatter of his coworkers, and the smell of bread baking, usually comforting, felt oppressive tonight. He told himself it was just a bad night, that the events of the previous evening were nothing more than a strange coincidence. But as the clock ticked toward closing time, James felt the dread return. "Got another delivery for you," his manager called out, holding up a ticket. James's stomach sank as he read the address. It was another house on Elmwood Street. James's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove toward Elmwood. The closer he got, the heavier the air seemed to grow. His phone buzzed with a notification from the GPS. "You've arrived at your destination." This time, the house was farther down the street, near the cul-de-sac. The black car was there again, parked under a broken streetlight. Its windows were still tinted, and the darkness inside felt almost alive. James parked his car a few houses away, his heart hammering in his chest. He grabbed the delivery bag and approached the house, forcing himself to appear calm. The house looked identical to the one from the night before. Dark, silent, and lifeless. He knocked once, twice. The door didn't open this time. Instead, James noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. The black car's driver's side door creaked open. James froze, the bag slipping from his fingers. A man stepped out of the car, his face still obscured by the hood of his jacket. "Hey!" James shouted, his voice shaking. The man didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and metallic. A knife? A phone? James didn't wait to find out. He turned and ran, adrenaline coursing through his veins. His car was only a few houses away, but it felt like miles. He fumbled with his keys, his hands trembling as he tried to unlock the door. Behind him, the man's footsteps were slow and deliberate, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. James barely made it home that night, his mind racing with possibilities. He called the police again, but they were skeptical. "Could have been a prank," the officer said, but James knew better. There was something methodical about the man's actions, something that suggested this wasn't random. Desperate for answers, James started to investigate Elmwood Street. Online forums, local news archives, even social media, he scoured every source he could find. That's when he stumbled upon an article. Serial attacks on delivery drivers. Police still searching for suspect. The article detailed a series of incidents eerily similar to what James had experienced. Delivery drivers called to remote or unoccupied locations, ambushed by an unknown assailant. One victim had narrowly escaped, while others weren't so lucky. James's blood ran cold as he read the final line of the article. The suspect is believed to drive a black sedan with heavily tinted windows. The text didn't stop. Every day, James received new messages from the unknown number. "Why don't you come back to Elmwood? We're not done yet. You looked scared last night. Why?" He tried blocking the number, but new ones would appear, each with the same chilling tone. Then came the photos. The first was a shot of James at work, taken through the sandwich shop's window. The second showed him sitting in his car, staring at his phone. The third was of his apartment building, his window to be exact. James decided he couldn't live in fear anymore. If the police wouldn't help him, he'd have to confront the stalker himself. Armed with a baseball bat and a determination born of desperation, he returned to Elmwood Street. The black car was there, parked in its usual spot. But this time, James didn't feel the same helpless terror. He gripped the bat tightly and approached the car. The windows were still tinted, but as he drew closer, he realized something was different. The car wasn't running. The door was slightly ajar. James yanked the door open, ready to swing, only to find the car empty. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly on the driver's seat. It read, "You think you're in control now, but the game is just beginning." James held the note in his trembling hands, its taunting words burning into his mind. He scanned the street, but the darkness revealed nothing. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. When he finally forced himself to leave, the sense of being watched clung to him like a shadow. But this time, instead of running home, James drove to the police station. He slammed the note onto the officer's desk, demanding they take him seriously. "Another prank?" The officer sighed, rubbing his temples. "This isn't a prank." James's voice cracked. "The guy's following me. He knows where I live, where I work. He's playing some sick game, and I'm not going to be his next victim." The officer looked unconvinced but agreed to send a patrol car to Elmwood Street. James left the station, frustrated and more alone than ever. Determined to find answers himself, James returned to his search online. This time, he expanded his focus, looking not just for recent crimes but for the history of Elmwood Street. Buried deep in the archives of a local blog, he found a chilling article from decades ago. Unfinished Homes, Unfinished Lives. The Elmwood Murders. The article described a tragedy that took place during the construction of the neighborhood. Workers claimed the land was cursed. Strange accidents had occurred. Fatal falls, unexplained fires, and tools vanishing only to reappear in dangerous places. The project was eventually abandoned, leaving a handful of half-finished homes to rot. Years later, a developer attempted to revitalize the area. But before the project was completed, residents began reporting a string of strange incidents. Shadows moving in the windows of empty houses, distant whispers at night, and, eventually, the disappearance of 2 children. The developer declared bankruptcy, and Elmwood Street became a ghost town. James leaned back in his chair, his heart racing. He felt a connection between the cursed history of Elmwood and the attacks, but he couldn't piece it together yet. The next night, James was at home trying to stay awake. He hadn't slept in days, terrified that closing his eyes might give the stalker the opportunity he needed. 3 a.m., his phone rang. It wasn't a number he recognized, but James didn't hesitate to answer. "Hello?" he whispered. There was no response, only the sound of breathing. "Who are you? What do you want?" The breathing grew louder, then a low, raspy voice replied, "You're closer than you think." James froze. He glanced at his window, half expecting to see the stalker's face pressed against the glass. The line went dead. James decided he couldn't wait for the stalker to make the next move. He returned to Elmwood Street, this time armed not only with the bat but also with a flashlight and his phone's camera. As he walked down the street, the wind howled through the empty houses, creating an eerie symphony. He approached the black car, still parked in its usual spot. He opened the door again, but this time, the interior wasn't empty. A photo was pinned to the dashboard. It was a picture of James taken from behind, showing him walking into the sandwich shop. "You sick bastard," he muttered under his breath. Suddenly, a noise echoed from one of the houses. A soft creak, like a door opening. James whipped around, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. "Hello?" he called, his voice shaking. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was the man in black, his face obscured by a mask. James didn't hesitate. He swung the bat, but the man was faster, dodging and lunging at James. They struggled, the flashlight tumbling to the ground, its beam flickering wildly. James managed to break free and sprinted toward the street, his heart pounding. Behind him, the man didn't follow. Instead, he stood in the doorway of the house, watching as James fled into the night. At home, James replayed the events in his mind. The man had had him cornered, yet he let him go. Why? Determined to find answers, James reviewed the photos he had taken inside the car and of the house. In the background of one photo, he noticed something strange. A faint, ghostly figure standing in the upper window of the house. It wasn't the man in black. James felt a chill run down his spine. There was something or someone else involved. James decided to return to Elmwood one last time, but this time he brought reinforcements. He convinced his coworker, Sam, to join him. Armed with a crowbar and a camera, the two ventured into the abandoned house where James had first encountered the stalker. Inside, the air was thick with dust and an overwhelming sense of dread. The walls were covered in crude symbols, scratched into the plaster. "This place is a nightmare," Sam whispered. As they explored deeper, they found a hidden door in the basement, locked with a heavy chain. Using the crowbar, they pried it open. Behind the door was a small room, lit only by a single flickering bulb. The walls were covered in photos, pictures of James at work, at school, at home. In the center of the room was a chair, and on it lay a note. "You were chosen." James and Sam stood frozen in the small, suffocating room, the walls pressing in on them. The photographs, countless and chillingly detailed, documented every moment of James's life over the past few months. Each image felt like a piece of a puzzle James couldn't yet solve. "Who does this?" Sam whispered, his voice cracking. James's eyes locked onto the chair in the center of the room. The note, written in jagged, almost childlike handwriting, chilled him to the core. "You were chosen." "Chosen for what?" James murmured. The single light bulb above them flickered violently, and for a moment, the room plunged into darkness. When it came back on, a new sound filled the air, a rhythmic tapping, echoing from the hallway they had entered. Sam gripped James's arm. "We need to get out of here." Before James could respond, the tapping grew louder, closer, each step deliberate and menacing. The two sprinted back toward the main floor, their footsteps reverberating against the hollow walls. The tapping continued, faster now, almost in pursuit. "Where's the damn door?" Sam shouted, panic in his voice. James skidded to a halt, shining his flashlight wildly. The front door was gone, no longer where it had been. In its place was a blank wall, the plaster smeared with strange symbols etched into the surface. "This isn't possible," James stammered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. Sam raised the crowbar, gripping it tightly. "Whoever's out there," Sam yelled, "come out!" But no one came. Instead, a low, guttural voice whispered from the shadows, so close it felt as though it came from inside their own heads. "It's not about you." The flashlight flickered again, and James caught a glimpse of something, or someone, lurking in the corner of the room. It wasn't the man in black. This figure was taller, its limbs unnaturally long, its face hidden beneath a hood. James grabbed Sam's arm, pulling him toward the staircase. "We go up. There's got to be another way out." They bolted upstairs, the house groaning beneath their weight. Each step creaked as if the building itself was alive, protesting their presence. At the top of the stairs, they found themselves in a long hallway lined with closed doors. Behind one, a faint scratching sound began, followed by a childlike giggle that sent shivers down James's spine. "This place isn't just abandoned," Sam whispered. "It's wrong." James opened the nearest door, revealing an empty room. But as they stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them, locking them in. "Great," Sam muttered, banging on the door. "Now what?" James's flashlight illuminated the room, revealing more symbols etched into the walls. These marks were deeper, almost carved with desperation. In the center of the room, on the floor, was a crude drawing of a spiral, its edges smeared with what looked like dried blood. The spiral seemed to pulse, drawing James's attention. "James?" Sam's voice sounded far away. James stepped closer to the spiral, feeling its pull. As he stared, the symbols around the room seemed to move, rearranging themselves into words. "It has always been watching." A loud crash snapped James out of his trance. Sam had broken the door down, his crowbar splintering the wood. "Come on," Sam yelled. They ran down another hallway, each step taking them deeper into the house. But no matter how far they went, they couldn't find an exit. The walls seemed to shift, twisting into new shapes. "This place is a maze," James said, his voice trembling. Suddenly, they heard the tapping again, this time louder, coming from multiple directions. It was no longer a single pursuer. "Move!" Sam shouted, shoving James forward. They burst into a larger room, this one filled with broken furniture and shattered mirrors. Reflections danced in the shards, showing distorted versions of themselves. In one of the mirrors, James saw the man in black standing behind him. He spun around, but no one was there. "James!" Sam pointed toward a trapdoor in the floor. With no other options, they pried it open and climbed down into the darkness below. The basement was cold, damp, and eerily quiet. The walls were lined with shelves, each holding objects that didn't belong. Childhood toys, wedding rings, photographs of people James didn't recognize. "This is some kind of sick collection," Sam said, his voice shaking. In the center of the room was a large circular table. On it was an open book, its pages filled with sketches of the symbols they had seen throughout the house. James flipped through the book, stopping at a page that depicted a ritual. The drawing showed a group of people standing in a circle, holding hands, with a figure looming above them. Beneath the drawing was a single line of text. "The chosen must return to complete the circle." "What does that mean?" James whispered. Before Sam could respond, the door they had entered slammed shut, and the tapping returned, louder, relentless, coming from all sides. The man in black emerged from the shadows, his face still obscured. Behind him, the hooded figure loomed, its presence filling the room with an oppressive weight. James realized the truth too late. They were never meant to escape. Weeks later, a new delivery driver disappeared after a routine run. His car was found abandoned on Elmwood Street, its engine still warm. Inside the vehicle was a single photograph, a picture of James and Sam, their faces frozen in terror, staring out from the basement of the cursed house. Elmwood Street remained quiet, waiting for its next visitor. The unwelcome visitor. Emily stood in the driveway of her best friend Lisa's suburban home, her car trunk packed with an overnight bag, a laptop, and a stack of books she'd been meaning to read. Lisa had begged her to house sit for the week, promising it would be a mini vacation, away from her cramped city apartment. "It's just the fish and the plants," Lisa had said, handing Emily the keys. "Oh, and ignore the creaky sounds from the upstairs floorboards. They've always been like that." The house itself was modest but inviting, its cozy interiors filled with warm wooden furniture and the faint smell of lavender. Emily had planned on a week of quiet evenings, binge-watching shows and maybe indulging in a bottle of wine. That plan unraveled on her first night. It was nearly midnight when Emily heard the knock at the door. Startled, she paused her show and muted the television. The knock came again, firm but not aggressive. Through the peephole, she saw a man, middle-aged with a grizzled beard, wearing a faded jacket. He stood on the porch, his eyes fixed on the door as though he could see right through it. "Who is it?" Emily called, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm looking for Lisa," the man replied. His voice was deep and gravelly, carrying a hint of impatience. Emily frowned. Lisa hadn't mentioned expecting anyone. "She's not here. Can I take a message?" The man hesitated before muttering, "No, that's all right," and walked away, disappearing into the night. Unsettled, Emily immediately called Lisa, who answered groggily. "Who was it?" Lisa asked, confused. "He didn't say. Just some guy looking for you," Emily replied. Lisa was quiet for a moment. "I don't know anyone like that. Just be careful, okay? Keep the doors locked." Emily double-checked the locks on every door and window before heading to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. The house seemed alive with unfamiliar noises, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of settling wood, the occasional chirp of a bird outside. At 3 a.m., she woke with a start, unsure what had disturbed her. The silence was heavy, pressing against her ears. Then she saw him. Through the curtains of the living room window, Emily caught a glimpse of the same man. He was standing in the front yard, motionless, staring at the house. Her breath caught in her throat as she grabbed her phone and dialed Lisa again. "Emily?" Lisa's voice was groggy. "He's back," Emily whispered. "The guy from earlier. He's just standing there." Lisa's tone sharpened. "Call the police, right now." Before Emily could respond, the man turned and walked away, disappearing down the street. By morning, Emily convinced herself the man was gone for good. She spent the day nervously tending to the fish tanks and watering the houseplants, keeping the doors locked and her phone within arm's reach. But that evening, as she got ready for bed, she noticed something odd. The front door was unlocked. "I know I locked it," she murmured, her pulse quickening. She checked the house again, finding nothing out of place, until she looked for her phone. It was gone. Panic rising, Emily grabbed Lisa's emergency landline and dialed the police. Within minutes, 2 officers arrived, combing through the house. They found no sign of forced entry, but one officer pointed out faint muddy footprints leading from the front door to the hallway. "Has anyone else been in the house recently?" the officer asked. Emily shook her head. Maybe a key was lost or stolen? The question lingered long after the officers left. Emily couldn't stop wondering how someone had entered the house without breaking in. The next night, Emily resolved to stay awake, armed with a kitchen knife and the bright light of a desk lamp. Every creak and groan of the house set her on edge, but nothing happened until 4 a.m. A soft scraping sound came from upstairs. Heart pounding, Emily crept toward the staircase, clutching the knife tightly. She reached the second floor and stood in the hallway, listening. The sound came again, this time from the spare bedroom. Emily pushed the door open slowly, her flashlight beam slicing through the dark. There, crouched in the corner, was the man. He turned his head toward her, his face blank and emotionless. In his hand was a forged key that gleamed in the flashlight's beam. Emily screamed, running back down the stairs and out the front door, dialing the police as she fled into the yard. The police arrived within minutes, finding the man still in the spare bedroom. He didn't resist arrest, his expression eerily calm as they led him away in handcuffs. When Emily told Lisa what had happened, her friend was horrified. But what puzzled Emily the most was the key. "Do you know how he could have gotten it?" she asked. Lisa hesitated. "No," she said, but her voice faltered. I don't know him, I swear." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that Lisa wasn't telling the whole truth. A few days later, Emily received a call from the police. "Ma'am, we ran the man's prints," the officer said. "He's a known trespasser, but there's no record of violent crime. However, something came up during our investigation." "What is it?" Emily asked, her stomach tightening. "We traced the key back to the manufacturer. It was part of a custom order for this house about 5 years ago." "That's impossible," Emily said. "Lisa only moved in 2 years ago." "Are you sure about that?" the officer asked. That night, Emily confronted Lisa about the man and the key. "You're hiding something," Emily said. "Who was he? Why did he have a key to your house?" Lisa's face turned pale. "I don't know. I bought this place from a private seller. I never even met the original owner." But as the days passed, Emily began to notice subtle changes in Lisa. She seemed jumpy, paranoid, always glancing over her shoulder. One day, Lisa called Emily in tears. "He's back," she whispered. "I saw him. He's watching the house again." Emily rushed to Lisa's house the moment she got her frantic call. When she arrived, Lisa was pacing the living room, her hands trembling. "I swear it's him," Lisa said, her voice a hushed whisper. "He was standing across the street, just staring." Emily glanced out the window but saw nothing. Why would he come back? The police arrested him. Lisa hesitated, her face pale. I think I know why." Emily's heart sank. "Lisa, what are you not telling me?" Lisa sat down, rubbing her temples as if trying to decide where to start. "When I bought this house, the seller was in a hurry to close the deal. It was weird, but I thought I was just getting a good deal. Then, a few weeks after moving in, I started getting letters." "Letters?" Emily asked. Lisa nodded. "From someone claiming to be the previous owner. They said they were forced to leave the house because of him. They warned me that if I stayed, he'd come for me too." Emily stared at her friend in disbelief. "And you didn't think to tell me this before? I thought it was just a prank," Lisa cried. "I didn't believe it until he showed up." Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Emily convinced Lisa to go through her old paperwork. Among the documents, they found the name of the house's previous owner, a woman named Margaret Wilkes. Emily decided to investigate further, diving into online archives and local records. What she found was chilling. Margaret Wilkes had vanished without a trace 2 years before Lisa bought the house. Her disappearance was still an open case, but one detail stood out. Neighbors had reported seeing a man loitering near the property in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The description matched the unwelcome visitor. Emily and Lisa took the mysterious key to a locksmith, hoping to learn more about it. The locksmith examined it closely, running his fingers along its grooves. "This isn't just any key," he said, his expression grim. "It's a skeleton key, custom-made to fit multiple locks in this house. Whoever had this key had access to everything." Lisa's face turned ashen. "But why would someone need a key like that?" The locksmith shrugged. "Usually, it's made for staff or caretakers who need access to all parts of a property. But if this guy has one, well, it's not good news." That night, Emily and Lisa decided to stay at a motel, too terrified to sleep in the house. As they packed their bags, Emily caught sight of movement outside. The man was back. He stood at the edge of the driveway, staring at the house with that same unnerving stillness. This time, he was holding something in his hand, a small notebook. "Lisa, we need to go," Emily whispered, her voice tight with fear. But before they could leave, the man walked up to the porch and slid the notebook under the door. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the darkness. Inside the notebook were pages of handwritten notes, each entry more disturbing than the last. "She doesn't belong here. I told her to leave, but she wouldn't listen. The house is mine." At the bottom of the last page, a date was scrawled: the day Margaret Wilkes disappeared. Lisa began to cry, clutching her arms as if trying to hold herself together. "This is my fault," she whispered. "I should have left when I got the letters." Emily shook her head. "No, this isn't your fault. But we need to find out who this guy is, and why he's so obsessed with this house." The next night, Lisa received another letter in the mail. This one was short and to the point. "Get out, while you still can." Lisa was ready to leave, but Emily insisted on staying one more night to confront the man and end the nightmare once and for all. Armed with flashlights, a baseball bat, and a sense of dread, they waited in the darkened living room. Around midnight, the doorknob jiggled. Emily held her breath as the door creaked open, revealing the man standing in the doorway. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. Before Emily could react, Lisa screamed, "Why are you doing this? What do you want?" The man stopped and tilted his head, as if considering her question. Then he spoke, his voice eerily calm. "This house isn't yours," he said. "It was never yours, and I'm here to take it back." Emily swung the bat, narrowly missing the man as he lunged toward Lisa. They fought, the living room descending into chaos. Furniture toppled, glass shattered, and the man's calm demeanor dissolved into fury. Finally, Emily managed to knock him unconscious. They tied him up with duct tape and called the police. When the officers arrived, they identified the man as Daniel Wilkes, Margaret's estranged brother. He had a history of mental illness and had been obsessed with the house, believing it was his birthright. The police discovered a hidden compartment in the basement, filled with Margaret's belongings and disturbing journals detailing Daniel's fixation on the property. Lisa sold the house and moved away, vowing never to speak of the incident again. But Emily couldn't forget. She often thought of Daniel's parting words as the police took him away. "You can lock me up, but I'll always come back. That house will always be mine." Years later, Emily drove past the old house. A for sale sign swayed in the wind, and the windows stared back at her like hollow eyes. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure in the upstairs window, a man with a grizzled beard, watching her. But when she blinked, he was gone. Shadows in the hall. Matt's evenings were sacred. After long days at the office, he craved the quiet solitude of his apartment, where he could unwind with his favorite games and escape into a world far removed from his daily grind. His setup was modest but comfortable. A high-end gaming chair, a PC that hummed with power, and a desk cluttered with energy drinks and empty snack wrappers. Tonight was no different. The glowing monitor bathed his room in soft hues of blue as Matt clicked through a tactical RPG. The muffled hum of city life outside served as the perfect white noise. But as the clock struck midnight, the hum faded into an unsettling silence. The faint knock at his front door startled him. Matt glanced at the clock. 12:07 a.m. It was late for visitors. He muted his game, listening intently. Maybe it was a neighbor or a delivery mix-up. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Who is it?" Matt called out, his voice carrying a mix of irritation and unease. No response. The peephole revealed only the dimly lit hallway. No shadows, no figures. "Probably some kid pulling a prank," he muttered, returning to his desk. Minutes passed, and the game pulled him back in. He was deep into strategizing his next move when a flicker on his monitor caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a glitch, an artifact of the game. But as the flicker persisted, he realized it wasn't on the screen. It was behind him. The faint reflection of a shadow darted across the glossy surface of his monitor. Matt's pulse quickened. He spun around, but the room was empty. "Relax," he told himself. "You're just tired." He turned the lights on, illuminating every corner of the apartment. Everything seemed in place. Yet, the air felt heavier now, as if the shadows themselves were watching. Unable to shake the feeling, Matt decided to check the hallway outside. He opened the door cautiously, stepping out into the dimly lit corridor. The silence was oppressive. He scanned the length of the hallway, his eyes adjusting to the poor lighting. Nothing. But as he turned to head back inside, a chill ran down his spine. His bedroom light, which he'd turned off earlier, was now on. "Did I forget?" he whispered to himself, though doubt lingered in his mind. He closed the door, locking it carefully. Gathering his courage, Matt stepped toward the bedroom. He hesitated at the doorway, listening. The soft hum of his ceiling fan greeted him, but nothing else seemed out of place. He flipped the light switch, and the room was bathed in warm light. His bed was unmade, clothes were strewn about, typical for him. But something felt wrong. The closet door was ajar. Matt's throat tightened. He couldn't remember leaving it open. "Okay, this is ridiculous," he muttered, trying to muster some bravado. He approached the closet and yanked the door open. Empty. Relieved, he turned around, only to see a shadow move swiftly across the hallway outside his bedroom. Panic overtook him. Grabbing his phone, Matt bolted out of the apartment and into the brightly lit street below. His hands trembled as he dialed 911, struggling to explain what had happened. The dispatcher remained calm, assuring him that officers were en route. Matt paced the sidewalk, his eyes fixed on his apartment windows, half expecting to see a face staring back at him. When the police arrived, they entered the apartment with weapons drawn. Minutes felt like hours as Matt waited, his imagination conjuring worst-case scenarios. Finally, an officer emerged. "We found someone inside." Matt's stomach dropped. The man they brought out was disheveled, his clothes torn and his hair unkempt. His eyes darted around wildly, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. "What did he want?" Matt asked, his voice shaking. The officer shook his head. "He wasn't carrying any ID, and he hasn't said a word." But what? "We found these." The officer held up a small bundle of knives, their blades gleaming under the streetlights. Matt's breath caught. "Knives? Plural?" The officer nodded grimly. "Looks like he'd been watching you for a while. We'll need to investigate further, but it's a good thing you called when you did." Despite the police's reassurances, Matt couldn't shake the unease that settled over him. He stayed at a friend's house that night, but sleep eluded him. Why had the man chosen his apartment? Was it random, or had he been targeted? And the most chilling question of all, how long had the man been inside before Matt noticed? Days later, the police informed him that the man had no known connections to Matt or his building. He had no criminal record, no motive, no explanation. "He's just disturbed," the detective said. "Sometimes there's no rhyme or reason to these things." Matt moved out of the apartment within a month, unable to shake the paranoia that had taken root in his mind. Every knock on a door, every flicker of shadow, sent his heart racing. But the worst part wasn't the fear. It was the memory of that reflection in his monitor, the shadow that had been standing behind him. Had the man been watching him for longer than he realized? Even now, in his new apartment miles away, Matt can't sit at his desk without glancing over his shoulder, because in the quiet moments, when the world is still, he swears he can feel a presence. Even after months of living in a new apartment, Matt still couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had taken root deep within him. The memory of that shadow, moving so swiftly behind him, just before he bolted out of the apartment, haunted his thoughts. He had to wonder, was the man stalking him all along? Or was it simply a random event, an encounter with someone who had no rhyme or reason to their actions? The police had been no help in providing answers. Their investigation into the man's background turned up nothing. No known connections, no criminal record, and no apparent motive. The man had been picked up on suspicion of trespassing, but that was all they could confirm. He was released without charges, simply a confused, homeless man with no discernible reason for being there. Matt couldn't accept it. It didn't feel random. The man had known where to hide. He had been watching, waiting for the right moment. There had to be more to the story than the police were telling him. One evening, as the shadows grew long and the air turned crisp with the bite of fall, Matt found himself standing in front of his old apartment building again, the place where it all happened. His heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't explain why he felt compelled to return. Maybe it was unfinished business, or maybe it was his subconscious trying to make sense of it all. He stood there for a while, just staring up at the building. The lights in the windows seemed eerily quiet, almost as if they were watching him too. A single light flickered in his old apartment. For a moment, Matt thought he saw a shadow pass by the window. His breath caught in his throat. Could it be? He quickly shook the thought from his head. It was all in the past now. The police had cleared the building. Nothing had happened. But the doubt lingered, creeping like the shadow that had haunted him that night. That night, Matt went home to his new apartment, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind raced, and the more he tried to ignore it, the stronger the feeling grew. It was as if something was still there, watching, waiting, just out of sight. He sat at his desk, trying to distract himself with work, but every time he glanced at the reflection in the monitor, he thought he saw movement. A fleeting shadow, a figure just behind him. The sensation was so strong that it nearly made him jump out of his seat. Was it just paranoia? Or was there something more? Something that had followed him from his old apartment? He glanced over his shoulder, his heart racing in his chest. The apartment was silent, empty, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. If anything, it intensified, as if the walls themselves were alive, holding their breath in the stillness. Weeks later, Matt would learn the truth. The man he had encountered in his old apartment wasn't a random stranger, nor had he just been wandering through the building. It wasn't until Matt had stumbled across a news article that things finally started to make sense. The man had been a former tenant, someone who had lived in the building years ago. He had been evicted under mysterious circumstances, but the authorities had never figured out why. In the time since, he had become obsessed with the building, returning over and over again, unable to let go. Matt wasn't the first person he'd targeted, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. The truth chilled him to the core. His paranoia hadn't been unfounded. The man had been following him for much longer than he'd realized. The final blow came when Matt discovered that the man wasn't gone. He wasn't even in the past. Matt received an anonymous letter one evening, slipped under his door. The handwriting was crude, almost frantic. "You thought I was done, but you don't leave. I never leave. I'll always be here waiting, just like before." The words sent a chill through his spine, deeper than anything he had felt before. Matt knew then that his nightmare was far from over. He wasn't just being watched. He was being hunted. The question was no longer whether the man would find him, but when. Matt's story didn't end with the man's departure. No, the real horror lay in the realization that sometimes we're never truly alone. The shadows linger. The presence follows, even when we move miles away. It could be a fleeting glance, a reflection in the corner of our eyes, or a shadow in the hall. And sometimes, the thing that watches us is much closer than we think. As we've seen tonight, the line between the ordinary and the terrifying is often thinner than we realize. These stories remind us that danger doesn't always announce itself with loud crashes or dramatic events. Sometimes, it's the subtle knocks, the fleeting shadows, the silence between breaths that can hold the deepest fear. Whether it's a stranger lurking in the darkness or a presence that can't be explained, one thing is clear: trust your instincts. They are often the only thing standing between you and the unknown. Stay vigilant, always aware of your surroundings, and never let the quiet moments lull you into a false sense of security. In the end, perhaps the scariest part of being alone isn't the solitude itself, but the eerie silence, the unsettling unknown that can creep in without warning, waiting patiently in the shadows. So, next time you find yourself alone, remember, you are never truly alone. The silence might be hiding something far more terrifying than you could ever imagine. Stay safe, stay aware, and never underestimate what may be watching from the shadows.